A theistic moral realist would be better than himself if he was an atheistic moral realist or an atheistic non-moral realist. Greater truth playing some factor is the claim. Now again, some factor, not a necessary factor, provided that you believe in free will. And again, the house is divided, I suppose, on that in many ways. If you believe in free will, of the libertarian sort, then you would believe that you can act against your knowledge of right and wrong. You can act against your strongest desires. And of course, then you could do, with all the best knowledge in the world, you could do the most heinous things. It's logically possible. But knowledge does seem likely to increase our actions in some way. Okay, so the claim would be that the Buddha, who was an atheistic, non-moral realist, would likely have been better if he had been a theistic moral realist. Look, we're not saying that the Buddha's disciple, who was a theistic moral realist, for example, I'm saying the Buddha himself, if he had this truer position or account of ethics, would in fact have been more moral than he is. And of course the Buddha was quite moral. Mother Teresa, the claim would be that she is likely would have been worse if she had been an atheistic moral realist, or certainly an atheistic non-moral realist. The same person would have been likely worse. Not necessarily worse, but likely is the claim. How's the time?
17 minutes.
All right, yeah, I'm going to stop there, because I could add more about rights and so on, but we'll take that up in our discussion.
Dude.
All right?
All right. You just want to toss the mic over.
About the questions, I'm going to say this quickly. Ask a question, don't go on a long rant and think you're awesome and talk about yourself and talk about comments and all that kind of stuff when you're asking the question. Keep it short, keep it direct. If you keep it too long, I'm going to cut you off. So, we're going to keep 1 or 2 questions, maybe 3 for Dr. Barkman right now, if anybody has any. Josh.
Real basic. What do you define goodness as?
What is goodness?
Yeah.
The good is the good. Right, the basic, when we talk about the good, we mean the summary of all moral commandments. Justice, perhaps. Treating each thing correctly. The basic attributes. Yeah.
What would you do with a person like Gandhi?
Well, I can't judge Gandhi's heart, and I actually don't know much about his personal beliefs. Whether he construed of God as in a theistic form or more Hinduistic or form, I don't know. But he could well fit into this. Certainly Gandhi did good things, and I don't think he was a theist. He might have been. Right, so, and I think he actually did good things. But I suspect if he was a theist, he would have done better things. That's the claim.
To use the term leap of faith, suggesting that there is such a faith that does not require a certain leap, whether how big or how small. You made it sound like faith, even in faith in Christ or in the Christian God, doesn't require a leap of sorts.
Oh, I think when I say leap of faith, we'd be saying that to go or to take a position without good reason to think so. And again, I'm of course not sympathetic to that from a Christian point of view or from an atheistic point of view. I suspect Justin is not either. You know I don't like tricky art. Go away.
All right, that's good.
Yeah. Nice somewhere.
So do you want to that? Just throw it on. So if you just want to...
Yeah, that's one. Thanks.
Is this on? You hear me okay?
I don't know if it's on.
No. Oh, is this on now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much. One quick correction to the posters. I do not have a doctorate. You don't have to refer to me as doctor or anything. And contrary to what I heard while I was in the washroom, so we heard conversation, I'm also not a philosopher, unlike my distinguished opponent. So just to set the record straight, because I am a moral, honest person. I want to make sure you know that. So I'm very grateful to be here today. I want to thank Redeemer College and, of course, the Redeemer Apologeticss Club for hosting this. And I especially want to thank my opponent, Adam, for engaging with me. He's a man who here needs no introduction, so I'm a little bit anxious, I suppose, to see what that means. I'm going to provide my rebuttal later. I'm just going to jump into my prepared remarks, and obviously we'll get to our conversation that I'm looking very forward to in a little bit. Let me begin with the Psalm of David, one of the Psalms of David, from the Torah, or the Old Testament, if you will. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have committed abominable deeds. There is no one who does good. Our debate tonight, as Adam referred to, is really two debates. Can we be good without God? And where does our morality come from? Those are two separate questions. Now, the first question, can we be good without God? I think it's trivial to prove in the affirmative. I don't think we're going to debate this much. I merely need to point out an atheist who does do good to falsify the idea that none who disbelieve in God can do good, which the psalm suggests. And there are many atheists who do good, even quite a few who live, by all accounts, exemplary moral lives. In fact, of the three of the four greatest philanthropists of the last century were atheists: Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, and George Soros, to name names. It's also a myth that there are no atheist charities. The Atheist Center in India performs sanitation services, provides drinking water, and healthcare. The Fellowship of Free Thought organizes blood drives and food banks. And my own organization, quick plug, Center for Inquiry, provides secular addiction recovery services. By the way, it's also a myth that there are no atheists in foxholes. A little beside the point, but I can't help including that. It's falsified by the Military Association of Atheists and Freethinkers, which has compiled a list of hundreds of members of the armed forces serving sometimes in foxholes, and it's symbolized by the Atheists in Foxholes Monument in Alabama. And of course, it's quite possible to be very, very bad and not only believe in God, but be very, very devout in that belief. Actually, Sufi Muslim mystics have an interesting interpretation of Satan, who they refer to as Shaitan in the Quran. In their view, Shaitan was kicked out of heaven for refusing to bow down before Adam, after God had compelled all of his angels to do so. Shaitan justified this rebelliousness by arguing that bowing to Adam would be inconsistent with monotheism. By the way, I won't be bowing to this Adam tonight either. Sufis saw this as a bit of a lesson in how sanctimoniousness, taken to an extreme, can pervert even such a belief as monotheism, which of course is very much at the core of Islam. Sufis were suggesting that evil can come from an absolutist commitment to holiness at all costs. Now, when we move from the level of individuals to that of communities, regions, or nations, we actually see evidence showing a correlation not between atheism and bad behavior, but the opposite. In his book, Society Without God, Phil Zuckerman looks at the Danes and the Swedes, where levels of atheism are among the highest in the world. The Scandinavians have a very strong commitment to social equality with highly developed welfare and healthcare services. In fact, in a 2005 study looking at 18 democracies, societies with higher levels of atheism tended to have relatively low murder, rape, and suicide rates, even lower levels of abortion and teen pregnancy. When we look at the prison population, we don't see them filled with atheists. Quite the contrary, in the US, atheists account for about 0.2% of the prison population, but at least 5% of the population as a whole. So I will rebut, in stronger terms, Adam's remarks about that an atheist could have done better, but I think the correlations there are at least instructive, at least provide some observations on that. Of course, it was in the best interest of the writers of the Bible to suggest to their peers that believing in their Bible was required to be good. Now on to the second and certainly the more interesting question. Where does our morality come from? What's the framework that it requires? In the interest of perspective, let me first tackle that by turning the issue on its head and asking, with all sincerity, can we really be good with God? In the larger sense of good, to which I'm now about to turn, can we be good merely by ascribing to a religious framework? Or do we need something more, something that must come from beyond the Bible or a religious tradition, a secular ethical framework? The problem with merely relying on God for morals dates back about 2,500 years to the Greek philosopher Plato, who you refer to. In the Euthyphro dialogue, Plato elucidates a paradox that is very much still at the heart of both theological and secular ethical questioning and debate. Many of you have probably heard of this already, but for those who haven't, I'm going to use a thought experiment that was developed by ethicist and secular humanist philosopher Paul Kurtz, model for me that he recently actually passed away, so I would like to refer to him. Kurtz would often conduct the following thought experiment with his students at the beginning of first year. He would ask them to imagine the story where God commands Abraham to show his faith by killing his only son Isaac. And then he would ask if the story couldn't have turned out the other way. Could God have allowed Abraham to actually go through with the sacrifice rather than sort of canceling it at the last minute? So think about that. Now, if you answer that yes, the sacrifice could have been commanded, could have been executed, that God did have the power to command the opposite of any of his commandments in the Bible, then you're suggesting that God's ethical commandments are, to an extent, at his whim. Now, if ethics are subject to God's whim, they become cosmically relative rather than absolutely objective. If they are subject to change, could we ever really keep track of them? If someone proposed a new revelation that suddenly contradicted our deep internal ethical beliefs, would we ever actually change our sense of revulsion to acts that we already know are wrong? No, instead we would probably reject the message and the messenger, because we would know that his revelation couldn't be coming from a good God. How would we know that? Just as most people answer that God had no choice but to call off the sacrifice, what is right and wrong is independent of God and his divine command, and subject to our independent judgment. That's my argument. God is himself at most a divine messenger, not a moral source. That source, whatever it is, must then be accessible directly by humanity. And that is why we do not require God for its foundation. What I'm arguing is that Christianity does not give us a non-problematic, ready-made moral system or foundation, because a list of laws and commandments is not at all a moral system. I think C.S. Lewis, the famous Christian apologist who I know you've written quite a bit on, I think he would have an interesting response there. He actually said, quote, "The ultimate question is whether the doctrine of the goodness of God or that of the inerrancy of Scripture is to prevail when they conflict." He goes on to say, "I think the doctrine of the goodness of God is the more certain of the two. Only that doctrine renders this worship of him obligatory or even permissible." So, in my limited non-philosopher interpretation of C.S. Lewis, he seems to be saying that understanding what is good, understanding right and wrong, comes before a commitment to a faith tradition, since only that understanding would allow us to decide that God is worthy of our respect and worship. Religious ethics are founded on a revelation contained in a book, and like all books, they are subject to interpretation. And here, like it or not, enters the role of humans in making decisions on ethical priorities. Religious ethics are themselves situational and inconsistent, showing evolution and change along with secular society in which they were embedded. The Pentateuch, the first 5 books written supposedly by Moses, shows many authors. In the Bible, every significant historical event, enslavement, conquest, exile, restoration, is stamped with divine approval. In Exodus, God commands humans not to kill, but then 12 chapters later in Exodus still, he says, "Put every man his sword by his side, go out from the gate throughout the camp, and slay every man his brother." In the Old Testament, God endorses the killing of children and slavery, etc. I'm going to skip over here a little bit. Now, I'm not, because you all know all the bad stuff in the Bible. Now, of course, there's also a lot of good, positive lessons in that book, and Christian apologists are quick to respond by evoking them. But in picking and choosing which of these stories to take seriously, you are using something outside of the Bible itself. Skipping ahead. So I'm arguing that biblical ethics themselves are quite situational. In fact, New Testament ethical views are grounded in the moral concerns of their own day, or they at least seem to be. They are based on responses to situations that were confronting the embryonic Christian church as Paul and other church leaders dealt organically with specific moral issues that would come to their attention. While critics might insist that secular ethics can only ever be subjective, I think that religious, especially commandment-style morality, has similar limitations, except it's the more dangerous of the two. Why? Because in a dispute